Hello and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you are joining us today. And I want to welcome you all to today's panel discussion, Serving Victims of Financial Fraud, Exploitation, and Abuse from Tribal Communities. My name is Rachel Gibson, and I'm with the National Center for Victims of Crime, where we work with victims, survivors, and allied professionals, all working on behalf of victims of crime. We're delighted to have you joining us today. I will be our facilitator or host, and we'll introduce my colleagues in just a moment. But before we begin, just wanted to give you all a few housekeeping things to know. First, this panel discussion is being recorded. So if you have any privacy concerns, please do not use the chat function because that will be public. The recording and evaluation and any materials will be shared in the post-panel discussion follow-up email in the next week or so. Let me say it again. This recording and evaluation and any follow-up materials will be shared in the post-discussion follow-up email in the coming weeks. You all should be able to hear me, but I shouldn't be able to hear you. If you cannot hear or have any connectivity issues, please send a message to Dash Coleman. Unfortunately, we are not able to give out certificates for this presentation. We will have live transcription available at the bottom of the screen for those who need it. Because this is a panel discussion and we want this to be conversational, we ask that if you have any questions, to please use the Q&A feature and not the chat feature so that we can collect those questions, share them with our panelists, and present them live. If you put them in the chat, they may get lost. So please use the chat to say your hellos and where you're from, and use your Q&A area to ask any questions that may come up during the course of the conversation. A brief description. While anyone can be a victim of financial fraud, exploitation, and abuse, tribal communities are often targeted. According to the FTC, tribal members are more likely to be the victims of scams and are less likely to report scams than any other group. For service providers or those working on behalf of victims in supporting individuals in tribal communities, it is imperative to understand the risk factors for victims, how risks can be mitigated, and culturally appropriate responses to working with victims of financial fraud, exploitation, and abuse. Today, I'm delighted to have with me today Sean Spruce, Financial Education Consultant for First Nations Development Institute, Alicia Nevakoya, Senior Program Associate with the Victim Assistance Supporting Tribe Center at the National Center for Victims of Crime, and Rob Massio, the FINRA Investor Education Foundation Director. We're going to have a really robust conversation, so please feel free to join in, ask questions, and be a part of this conversation. I'll turn it over to Sean to get us started.
Well, thank you for that warm introduction, Rachel. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking at some of the responses already, the welcomings and greetings in the chat box. And it looks like we've just got a wide array of communities, both tribal and other, from across the country. So I'm really excited to be part of this panel and to talk more about fraud and its impact on tribal communities. And I think the first point that we really want to underscore is that Native American communities are being targeted for fraud like never before, and it essentially has to do first and foremost with access. And as we all know, via technology, using a device as simple as this cheap cell phone here, somebody from the other side of the world can access a tribal community that at one time might have been more remote, might have been more rural, and now we're accessible. So people are able to go and connect with tribal people in ways like never before. And as amazing and democratizing as the power of technology is, it also creates risks and it creates challenges. And when bad actors come along and they see opportunities, they can use technology to exploit tribal communities like never before. So that's just one of the topics we're going to talk about today as we continue on this great panel.
So Sorry, couldn't get my unmute button to unmute. Thank you for that, Sean. So let's start with what I think is a hard but an easy question, right? Why even talk about this intersection of financial fraud and exploitation with tribal communities? What makes this topic unique? I'll start with you, Alicia.
Thanks. Well, I think that American Indian people are at this intersection of jurisdictional boundaries where, their crimes are having to be reported to sometimes state, local, federal, and tribal authorities. And there's a lot of confusion around exactly who to report to, whether a crime has been committed, and making sure that our communities are really safe and educated in these issues. A lot of times the confusion just really leads to not doing anything by any sort of law enforcement officials, because they're also confused about who to go to, whether these are crimes, and how to keep our communities safe. So we're here to help educate and to give some great pointers about how to protect yourself going forward, and make sure that other people are aware of what's happening to our folks in the communities.
Alicia, I think that's a great point, because oftentimes fraudsters, scammers, perpetrators are banking on the fact that people don't know where to go for help, and that there is no help out there. And so I think that really sort of set the tone for today. Sean, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I would, yeah. And what Alicia is referring to is some of these issues, these jurisdictional issues that have arisen as a result of a big Supreme Court ruling a couple of years ago, the McGirt decision, and subsequently some related rulings that impact that. And there are these jurisdictional questions right now with regard to who has the authority to prosecute certain crimes on reservation land, and what is reservation land. So I think right now you have potentially bad actors who are looking at that environment right now, like in northeastern Oklahoma and perhaps in other parts of inland country as well. And they're thinking, well, geez, if I commit a crime such as fraud, it's possible that the state won't be able to prosecute me. But at the same time, it's possible that federal prosecution, they might not have the capacity, or a tribal prosecutor, they might not have the resources or the capacity to prosecute me. So maybe my case might just fall through the cracks, and I won't be prosecuted, or my case might not even be investigated. Now, I think that would be not a wise decision. I think that would be a very risky decision for a potential criminal to make, but you never know. They might just take that chance. And ultimately, the victim is going to be potentially a Native American person who's exploited because of some of these jurisdictional questions that have arisen in recent years.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's important to consider. And I wonder, is there does this decision, the McGirt decision, does it affect if the perpetrator is an enrolled tribal citizen or non-native in the prosecution of these sorts of crimes federally or statewide? And again, how does that go back to serving the needs of victims who are experiencing this?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some issues there with regard to whether or not the victim is Native American, whether or not the perpetrator is Native American. And it just reflects back on some of these questions that have arisen, not just with regard to where the crime is committed in terms of the land. Is it reservation land? Is it not reservation land? Because of the ruling now, a large swath of northeastern Oklahoma, including the city of Tulsa, is considered reservation land. But then again, of course, like you mentioned, whether or not is it the perpetrator who's Native versus a non-Native person? These are just some questions that I think people are considering. And also from a victim standpoint, yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it's something, well, geez, if this person has committed this crime, if I do, earlier it was mentioned that these cases aren't always reported. Well, a lot of times a Native American person might be questioning, well, geez, that person who committed that fraud on me, they're not Native. So now I'm not sure. Maybe I can't report them, or maybe I don't know which authority to go to report them. So yeah, it creates just a whole grab bag of potential challenges and issues that could arise, impacting Native American people who could potentially be victims on all levels.
Thank you. And Rob, do you have anything you'd like to add to this?
Not necessarily on the McGirt piece, but just more generally, why this is important. We know that nobody's immune to frauds and scams. Nobody's immune. And we also know, based on research that the FINRA Foundation has done with Better Business Bureau, that the more people know about the scams that are out there, how they operate, what exactly is occurring out in the world, in the scam world, the more protected they will be, the less likely they are to engage and ultimately be victimized. So by having this conversation, and by you all going out into the community and having that conversation about, okay, these scams are occurring, these frauds are happening, not to scare people, but to make them aware, to make sure that they understand and they know that these are out there and nobody is immune. The more that we can talk about it, the more people understand what is happening out there in the scam world, the better protected everybody can be.
I think that's a good point. And I think too, to consider as well, to your point that anyone can be a victim of or experience victimization of these sorts of crimes. But when we think about the way in which communities like tribal communities have other barriers and access to services that maybe some of their mainstream counterparts may not have because of societal implications, oppression, systemic issues, then they may also experience other forms of violence or other forms of crime or other forms of sort of lack of access because of that history there. So I appreciate you all sort of spending some time on that. We'll transition to our next question. And as a reminder for folks, as we're having this conversation, if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and put those in the Q&A area. So as we think about that and that sort of bridge between the understanding that, these sorts of crimes can affect everyone, but there are some, or could be some, significant risk factors for tribal members to become victims of financial crimes. And how big of a role does isolation on reservations, COVID-19 having isolated many people, and what does it mean if I live in an urban community? How are all of those things tied together? And what does it mean when we talk about these sort of risk factors? I'll start with you, Sean.
Well, COVID-19 hit tribal communities especially hard. Native American communities really, really were impacted. Huge case counts, a lot of fatalities. And specifically, I'm thinking of the Navajo Nation that was just really, really hard hit for a long time. And even after other parts of the country where it kind of subsided, they were still getting really, really hit hard. And they were lockdowns on the entire reservation and blocking that down. So yeah, I think that tribal communities were potentially really at risk during COVID. And we had a lot of reports of people targeting tribal communities with, the fake vaccines, cures, remedies, things like that. Also, like trying to broker personal protection equipment and things like that. And again, you had, a lot of our elderly people, they're alone, they live in isolation, or they're in remote communities. And it was just a huge risk there, with people already being alone and then being isolated and cut off from family and not being able to necessarily communicate. And then when somebody comes along and contacts them and offers them, hey, I can help you with this, I can provide some sort of relief for you with regard to what you're going through and what you're suffering. And these people might already be disoriented. They might already be struggling from grief from other loved ones who've passed away or been sick. So yeah, we definitely saw an increase, an uptick in Native American people being targeted for fraud during the pandemic because of some of these systemic issues that the pandemic really exacerbated.
Thank you for that. I'll ask my colleagues, Rob, Alicia, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that during COVID-19, there was a tremendous amount of money hitting the ground in American Indian communities for COVID-19 relief. Under the CARES Act, under ARPA, there were tribes that were giving out checks for COVID relief, COVID PPE, and other types of things. And when American Indian people have money in the community, every business in that community knows. And so their transaction rates go up, their food prices go up, car sales go up, hidden fees, hidden services. All of these fees are going up in American Indian communities. And because we're in a vulnerable place anyway, they're preying on our emotions. These folks are trying to defraud us of our money in any way that they can, through romance scams, through safety issues with their families, through COVID-19 and grief. So businesses in the community know that American Indian people have money, and so the fees for transacting standard business transactions go up as well. So that's some of the ways that COVID-19 affected American Indian people and fraud in the community.
And I'll add, I mean, when it comes to money, it's tricky because there's two sides of ability to be targeted, right? You have the money, so you're targeted because you have the money. But we also know that financial insecurity, the inability to come up with, say, that $2,000 to meet an emergency need, that's one of the factors that causes individuals to engage when it comes to different types of scams that are out there. So aside from financial insecurity, also isolation. So Sean talked about isolation. And again, that's one of those factors that makes people more susceptible to engaging with the scam and ultimately being victimized. So you have both sides of that. You have the social isolation, you have the financial insecurity, but then you also might have individuals that have received some more of that funding and have the money to spend, which then fraudsters and scammers look at and say, okay, I'm going after the big money.
Thank you for that. I think you all made some really valuable points, and sort of, again, thinking about how the fraudsters will use pandemic or isolation or big life events or things happening in communities to really seek out people who may be vulnerable because what they see going on. So that was great conversation. Thank you for that. We also want to make a note that someone has shared some of the McGirt materials in the chat. So we will get that added to our resource list as well, because it seems like folks have a lot of good questions and thoughts about that. So thank you for sharing that. We'll transition into our next question, which is, are there cultural factors to consider concerning Native Americans or tribal folks being targeted? What are some of those cultural things that, if I am a service provider, a banker, if I am working at a community-based organization, what are some of those cultural implications that may be different as I'm serving folks from tribal communities? And I'll start with you, Alicia, and then go with Sean.
Well, I think that one of our values as American Indian people is generosity. And so we want to give to our family members and to one another to take care of our community. And being generous to your family, being generous to your community could maybe play into being a victim of these frauds as well. Taking care of one another really sort of lends to the scam that people are trying to get money out of you. I read the FTC report to Congress. Romance scams are high on the list of how American Indian people are being scammed. So, if you feel like maybe you're in love with somebody who's asking you for money, and that feeling of generosity is there, and you'll want to give that person that you care for money, I think that lends to some of the cultural factors that is unique to American Indian people, that leads to their being defrauded out of money.
So I'll add to that. And I'll use my own people as an example. I'm a Pueblo person from New Mexico, and I will tell you that our Pueblo people, traditionally, we lived in very communal types of settings, in villages, and we were very much traditionally based on focusing on the good of the community as opposed to the individual. And what that resulted in, and what continues today, is that we're very mindful and respectful of authority. And like in my own community, it's really frowned upon to be vocally critical of tribal government or critical of practices. We're very much taught to just, follow the status quo. And it's a beautiful culture. It's a beautiful tradition. It's a strong culture. But what that culture does in some ways, I think, is it makes us a little bit more hesitant to stand up for ourselves in certain situations or be abrupt. So for example, if somebody's calling us or approaching us and trying to sell us something that doesn't seem right, we might be a little less hesitant to just say, look, leave me alone. I'm not interested. Get out of my way. Hang up that phone. I think we're just going to, maybe just try and be a little bit more polite or just kind of listen to them for a little bit longer. And as we all know, all it takes is just that one big toe in the door, right? Just that one opportunity. If that potential scammer can just keep that person engaged just a little bit longer, it could be the difference between getting that person to fall for whatever it is they're trying to hustle them with and not. So I do think that's one of the cultural components from my own people that I think does potentially make us more susceptible in some cases to fraud and bad actors.
Thank you for that. And Rob, this got me to thinking about some of the tactics that we talk about in our taking action, to do a shameless plug, taking action to assist victims of financial fraud toolkit and webinar, where we talk about social consensus, where we talk about source credibility. Can you dive a little deeper into some of that and talk about some of those connections here?
Sure, absolutely. So what Rachel's referring to, it's kind of these persuasion tactics, and they boil down to marketing tactics, really. Anybody that's spent any time watching infomercials or some sort of a home shopping network, you've seen these tactics in play, and they work. They work in marketing, but fraudsters also know that they work, and they play on individuals' different emotions. So for example, one would be phantom riches, and that is dangling that prospect of wealth, painting that picture of what your life might be like with a sudden windfall of cash. Alicia mentioned earlier about people having received extra income or extra money, COVID relief money. Well, fraudsters might be able to look at that and say, well, I know you have this amount of money, but I can make that even greater. So they're dangling that prospect of wealth. That's one of the tactics. Another one is reciprocity, and this one kind of plays on what Sean was talking about, that community piece. Reciprocity is, I'm going to do something for you in hopes that you do something for me. And a lot of times we see this in the traditional kind of free lunch type of scenarios, but it could be more than that, where somebody comes in and says, I'm going to give you a free lunch. You're going to listen to me talk about whatever it is I'm going to talk. And at the end, my hope is that you're going to feel like you owe me something. So then you're going to be more willing to listen, more willing to hand over money to invest with me, or whatever it may be. That concept of reciprocity is one I think that hits exactly what Sean was mentioning before. Social consensus, that's a tactic where other people are doing it, you should be doing it too. And that kind of falls in with that affinity fraud, which I think is also a relevant point. Other people within the community have gone along with this, or had invested, or have done whatever to be part of this group. You should consider it too, because everybody else is doing it. You want to be part of that group that's doing it as well. Scarcity is another one of those plays. And this one, if you think about like a home shopping network or one of those infomercials, that the Tupperware is selling out fast. You've only got a certain amount of time before we're out of the blue Tupperware. You might be able to get the white one, but who wants white? You want the blue one. That's scarcity. They're showing that there's a limited time in order to get that product. And again, scarcity is a tactic that's used by scammers. They try to make it seem like if you don't act now, you're going to miss out on that opportunity. And then the last one is source credibility. And Rachel talked about who everybody is. Sean mentioned that he's Pueblo. Those are plays on source credibility. You should listen to us because this is our background. This is where I come from. This is the community I'm from. That source credibility play is one that makes people feel comfortable. They make you want to trust the person more because there's some kind of either a connection, or there's some sort of education or experience that makes it seem like this person is more trustworthy. It's a shortcut to trust, but it can easily be faked. So those are some of those persuasion tactics, and again, they're tactics you'll see in the marketing world. but fraudsters use them as well, and they use them because they work.
Thank you for that, Rob. Anyone have anything else they'd like to add to this conversation?
I just wanted to touch on, Alicia mentioned romance scams, and that is just such a hot topic, and we're continuing to see more and more instances of romance scams across the board. And we're seeing this shift also to a twist on a romance scam, where individuals, they're being targeted through a typical romance scam, but instead of the way that it's progressed in the past, where the next step is, okay, let's meet up. I need money to come and meet up, or I have this emergency, can you send me money? They're moving it over to a different way, where they're starting to introduce people into different crypto platforms or different investing platforms. And the thought is now, okay, we're building up this relationship, we're building up that trust. And then I've got a great way for you to make a little extra money. It's worked great for me. They direct you over to maybe a crypto platform, which is a fictitious platform that's created for the sole purpose of extracting money from individuals. So it has a pretty a nasty term. It's called pig butchering that's been talked about across the industry. But it's that concept of you're building up that relationship, you're building up that trust, and then moving them over to some other platform to extract that money.
Right. And I think that goes back to that conversation we were having about COVID-19 and isolation and people wanting connection, right? We're humans and we crave that human connection. And so when people are developing these online relationships, and I see your hand, Sean, and in thinking that through and how people are utilizing loneliness and isolation. And even when we think about older adults and how their community is dwindling because they're getting older and people are passing on. And so not having, your community to check in with about scams or frauds or what that may mean. So that's a really great point. Sean, you had something you wanted to add?
I just want to add one more layer to the conversation regarding romance scams. And, a lot of times if somebody's falls prey to a romance scam, the response is, well, we need to get this person away from that person, that scam, right? Let's just get them away. And then that creates a whole level of emotional disruption in that person's life. And what's really frightening right now is that whole idea of like how to work with somebody who's been a victim of a romance scam, those emotional elements. It's a very new field of mental health. So practitioners and counselors, they don't have a lot of experience like how to deal with the emotional side of that in addition to the financial side. So it's a huge risk, both emotionally and financially, and just the fact that it's increasing so much and Native American communities are being targeted more and more with that is just all the more reason to underscore the severity here.
Yes. And I think that's a really good point. Alicia, I see your hand as well. When we talk about those intersections with intimate partner violence, because that's my background. And we talk about the emotional connection that people have. And there's a statistic that says folks who experience financial fraud and exploitation sort of crimes often exhibit the same trauma symptoms as someone who's experienced violent crime. And so I think that's something, important to consider, because whether or not it's happening online, whether or not it's happening in person, there is an emotional element there. There is a trauma experience there as well. Alicia, you had something, but I do want to come to I do want to come to a point that someone mentioned about the language around financial grooming versus pig butchering. And I think just to provide some clarification, it sounds like those are terms being used in sort of an academic or more business way. We're not necessarily having that conversation in that way with victims and survivors. But I appreciate you all flagging that and again, thinking about the language, because we talk about that, especially in this work about language matters and victim blaming language versus, language that can be receptive for folks to be able to hear. Because oftentimes here at the National Center, we talk about the fact that many folks, tribal communities or not, don't even recognize that they are a victim. And so using language that can resonate with them, and especially when we think about cultural contexts and certain ways in which we talk about the work may not resonate in tribal community or communities of color or LGBTQ or whatever community we're talking about. So I appreciate you sharing that. Alicia, I'll turn it over to you.
I just wanted to add that if you're a victim of any of these scams or you fall prey to any of these, you could feel very embarrassed by what the money that you've given, the emotion that and time and investment that you've made into the scam, but it's not your fault. These people want something that is not theirs, and that is your money. So talk about it, report it. Make sure that you are alerting somebody that you trust in the community, because you're probably not the only one that these people are victimizing.
That's really important too. I got y'all chatting it up now. I love that, Rob. Just one comment want to make there to tie it back, and then I'll turn it over to you. I think that's also important to note too, Alicia. One of the things that I connect financial fraud and tax facilitated crimes and intimate partner violence with is that these are all similar crimes in that they often will see that society will blame them for the experiences that they are having, right? You should have known better. You shouldn't have warned that. Why were you dating online? Why were you doing these things? And we don't put that onus back on the perpetrator of those crimes. And I know there's, when we think about chronic fraud victimization and the psychology behind all of that, our job as advocates is to always believe those survivors, those victims, and really help them feel empowered, because there is that shame that comes with that, especially when we think about older adults or people living with disabilities, where they may be fearful to come forward because they may be taken from their home. They may get a report made on them, and their caregiver, if it's a caregiver perpetrating the violence, their caregiver may be removed, or they're supposed to be wise, right? Older adults and a lot of cultural specific communities are often considered and revered for their wisdom, their expertise. They've lived a long life, and so they should know better. And so it's important for us to really sort of validate that and make sure that they do feel that they can come forward. I believe, Sean, was it you that had your hand up? Or
I had
Alicia?
my head up.
I knew it was someone. Go ahead, Rob. Thank you.
So there's been a lot that we've covered, and I had so much that I could go on. I'm going to try and keep it somewhat short because I know we want to keep moving through. In the chat, there was comments about trauma-informed response. I know Rachel was talking about it. The words that we use, they really do matter. FINRA Foundation, we did working on a project with AARP where we're focusing on the words that we use. Just simple terms like they fell for the scam. Well, that's a term that we use in common language, but it's placing blame on the victim. When we think about more violent crimes, we don't use those same terms anymore. We again put the blame on the perpetrator, which is where we need to, as a society, start moving towards putting the blame on the perpetrator when it comes to financial fraud. But we also need to know our audience. So I know that the financial grooming, it's a great term. I know I've used it, and it depends on your audience, right? So if you're working with an individual that has been a victim, yes, financial grooming is a much nicer term than pig butchering. And as Rachel said, in the academic world, even in probably if you're interacting with somebody in a police department or anything like that, they're going to know pig butchering before they're going to know financial grooming. So it's knowing your audience that's such an important factor, but keeping in mind that language that you use. So whenever you're interacting with a victim, making sure you're choosing your words appropriately and making sure that we're not putting blame on that individual. The last thing I wanted to cover on was on the romance scam piece. We talked about the emotional impact. There's also the impact of the fact that we live our lives online. So if somebody has been victimized, they've been targeted through a romance scam, which was likely perpetrated through online means, their willingness and comfort level for getting back on the computer might be low. So looking for ways to kind of rebuild that confidence. And one of the partners that the FINRA Foundation works with is the Cybercrime Support Network. And they've created this fantastic peer support program for survivors and victims of romance scams. And it's a 10-week program where they work with these individuals through a variety of different curriculums to help with the emotional piece, to help with the safe internet living piece, to help with the confidence. So if anybody is interested in that, again, it's the Cybercrime Support Network is the organization. And you can go over to their website to get more information on that peer support program.
Awesome. Thank y'all for that robust conversation. I was thoroughly enjoying that. We could stay on that all day, but we will continue forward. But as we're sort of thinking about we talked a little bit about romance scams and the financial grooming, pig butchering. We talked a little bit about some of those ways that perpetrators will seek out victims. Are there other sort of financial fraud or scams or things that might be pertinent for tribal community members or folks working with tribal community to know about and sort of think about as they're seeing victims and survivors seek out for services? Rob, I'll start with you.
Okay, so I'll start with kind of the broad picture. What we know from reports that have been made to the Better Business Bureau through their scam tracker database, we know some of the top categories of scams: online purchase scams, employment scams. Those are really the two big ones that kind of transcend across all age groups from a broad perspective. So again, nobody's immune to different types of scams, and online purchase scams, we're spending more and more time online. So it makes sense that more and more instances of online purchase scams are occurring. I know I opened my email before we got on and I saw 4 different emails that were all scam emails. One was IRS, where it had a little comma after the I, a comma after the R, and it's really small. Looking at it on my phone, you're just going to kind of gloss over it and think that maybe it is the IRS. And then there's other online companies that are selling things. I'm not going to mention names, but I get the emails about that. Your package is trying to be delivered. Help the driver find your location. So it's a constant barrage of different types of scams that are coming in through online means. And then employment scams. If you have individuals that have been impacted by a down economy or impacted by COVID, they're looking to try to increase their income. Well, employment scams are one of those methods that scammers are using to extract that money from individuals.
Thanks, Rob. Sean, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I do. Yeah, I can get really specific. And there's one really, really alarming scam that I dealt with. Actually, I worked with 2 people that had unfortunately been victimized by this scam. One was an elderly gentleman in South Dakota, and then a woman in the state of Idaho. And these were both Native American people. And it was kind of a classic imposter scam, a play on the old IRS scam that Rob just mentioned, but the one where they actually call you and they spoof the IRS number and they say you owe back taxes. Well, in this case, the caller spoofed a Washington, D.C. number, but presented themselves as a representative from the U.S. Treasury Department. And they said, we have special grant opportunities available only for Native American people. Now, really, U.S. Treasury Department is just randomly calling Native American people, offering these potentially free grants for people to access. But again, they spoofed the number. They spoke right. They established that trust and that source credibility that Rob mentioned earlier, and they were able to connect with these 2 people. And sure enough, we're going to send you this money. You're Native American. You're going to get this grant. But of course, there was a fee involved, right? And how do they want payment? We want iTunes credit. So in both cases, unfortunately, these people sent them, stayed on the line with that guy in South Dakota long enough for him to run down to a convenience store and purchase X number of dollars worth of iTunes credits and waited for him to scratch off the numbers and gave him. And then, of course, there was no grant. Nothing ever came of it. But I think what we really need to understand is that these people, they are targeting Native communities like never before, like I mentioned earlier, through technology. They know where Native communities they are. They know, obviously, whoever this person was knew that these 2 specific people were Native American and lived in Native American communities, and then just created an imposter scam to play off of that. So yeah, that's a very specific example I can give of a scam that we're all familiar with, but tweaked in a way to target Native American people.
I think that's so important to talk about too, because there is this sort of we take the government at face value, right? They if the government tells me to do something, or law enforcement or someone says, you're supposed to do this thing, I'm a law-abiding citizen. I want to make sure I'm doing that. And so what we're seeing is folks who are perpetrating fraud and scams really reaching out and saying, I'm with this law enforcement agency or with Social Security. And for folks who are not familiar with how those government organizations work, they can be, again, afraid. I've heard older adults in the context talking about they're afraid their Social Security number. What that means. So I appreciate you bringing that up and talking that through. A moment of pause. I want to make sure we bring up in the chat. Our friends are here from the FTC. Thank you all for joining. And we had a NCVC specific FTC reporting link that we will share with folks post webinar. But that leads me to the conversation. And it looks like Rosario put another link in there around Native American communities and how to report that fraud with the FTC. So thank you for that. And hello to our friends at the FTC who have joined us today. But one of the things that I think about too is oftentimes with these sorts of crimes and things that people are experiencing, our first sort of suggestion is report, right? And reporting can mean a lot of things for a lot of people. And when we're talking about tribal communities, there could be some aversion to reporting to law enforcement. And so can you all talk about some ways that people can report to maybe the FTC, local tribal jurisdictions, or what does that mean for tribal communities when we say report, and who can they report to? I'll start with you, Alicia, and then Sean.
I just want to, go back to the fact that, this is a community that is very underbanked. So they're dealing in cash a lot of times. They're dealing in gift cards. They are dealing in a lot of alternative banking alternative banking transactional, cards, et cetera, because there's not banking on the reservation. And so the rural nature of the reservation makes it very difficult to bank. So, there are online scams and then there are on the ground scams that are being perpetrated against communities every single day. And so when you feel like maybe you've been taken advantage of, or you're not even sure, talk to somebody that you trust. Call NCVC, call FINRA, call your local law enforcement. If you feel comfortable, talk to your neighbors about it. I would like to see the tribes create a Secretary of State office or some sort of complaint hotline at the tribal level to make sure that tribal members have a safe place to go and feel trusted and heard when these things come about. Maybe it can be anonymous, but American Indian tribal governments should be doing more to protect their people in these consumer affairs issues. They can call the state, they can call the FTC, the Better Business Bureau. There are a lot of places that they can go. A lot of times, I think tribes are, one, embarrassed, and two, don't know that they've been a victim of fraud or crime, and that these are reportable offenses that they should be talking about to the enforcement community. So we need to be better at educating our folks on the ground about these issues.
Thank you, Alicia. And you brought up so much good meat there that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But the first piece I loved is around talking to your community, because what people who choose to perpetrate these crimes are banking on, again, is that you're isolated, that you're not going to talk to other folks. And so word of mouth can be one of the most powerful tools in helping communities sort of think about frauds that are introduced. So have you heard this thing? Do you know this person? Who is this person? What is this thing? And having those conversations. I love that someone put in here the Nextdoor app. If you're not familiar with that, it's an app that connects you to your neighborhood and your community. And in my community, it's always, is it Are there fireworks? We apparently have fireworks year round in my community, but people are always talking about the fireworks or a dog got loose. But that is another place where I have seen people say, hey, somebody's going door to door and it's weird. Don't answer your door for, weird people showing up. And that's a way we're seeing communities sort of get back together and holding people accountable for that. Sean, do you have something you want to add?
I do, yeah. In addition to those traditional sources that we've outlined, law enforcement, FTC, CFPB, I would also suggest perhaps if somebody is in a Native community and they've been targeted, to reach out to perhaps a community development financial institution, a local Native CDFI. They exist in quite a few Native communities, and these are financial services, nonprofits, and they're actively engaged in financial education and consumer awareness, and that could be a good resource as well for somebody to report or just give a red alert out to. I also, certain tribes that have really robust consumer protection laws. For example, the Navajo Nation has a very, very strong consumer protection code. And they actively, take a very strong interest in anybody that's targeting Navajo Nation citizens for fraud and things like that. So, and then again, like you mentioned, the Nextdoor app, and sometimes just going on Facebook and saying, like you said, hey, there's somebody out here, they're going door to door, or I just got a phone call. Who is this person? Yeah, the power of social media can definitely be a huge factor as well.
And Rachel, I would just add, don't feel like you need to report to just one. Report to as many places as you possibly can. Especially, we're talking about the Nextdoor app. Don't stop there, because reporting to the Nextdoor app, sure, it notifies your neighbors that are signed up to that same service, but it's not notifying other people. It's not necessarily notifying law enforcement. It's not notifying whoever it is that can actually go in and investigate the concern. So if it's in the financial world, report it to FINRA, report it to the Securities and Exchange Commission. If it's just different types of frauds and scams, there's Better Business Bureau. We've talked about all those different places to report, Federal Trade Commission. But it doesn't hurt to report to as many places as you can. A lot of times, our organizations, we do share the data. So if something comes into FINRA and it's not within our jurisdiction, we'll make sure it's referred to the appropriate agency. But don't rely on that. Report it to as many different places as you possibly can.
Rob, I love that. And that's one of the things we talk about in sort of just broad-based victim services, is that victims and survivors should have as many options as possible for reporting and for seeking help and for seeking resources. And so what may work for me may not work for someone else. But when we provide folks who are experiencing these sorts of crimes as many options as possible to make the best decision for themselves, then we are empowering victims and survivors to take that control back, to feel like they have a voice, that they have the ability to sort of be a part of that process. So I think you all have given some great examples of all of the different sorts of options that people can take and seeking out what might work best for them. So thank you all for that. We did get a question, and I want to scroll back to it in our Q&A. Remember, you can post questions in the Q&A, but this question came from a participant who asked, are the job scams, I think, Rob, that was you who talked about online job scams, but are the job scams for online jobs, or what are the jobs that people are sort of fraudulently soliciting people to work for?
Sure, and there's a variety of different ways that individuals can classify a job scam. A lot of them can be those online type of work from home, or I'm going to give you a check, you're going to go out and purchase information or go out and purchase materials or your computer or anything like that. And then they might come back and say, oh, I need you to reimburse me. There's plays on that, but it could also be just a phishing expedition, right? Where an individual is hoping that you click on the link to apply to a in-person job through a certain job board. But it's a link that's designed to once you click on it, to track your information, to infect spyware, malware, whatever it may be. So it can take a variety of different tacks, and all those would kind of classify as an employment type of scam.
Thank you. Well, we have about 11 minutes, 12 minutes left, and I want to end on a high note. So as we're thinking about, we've talked a lot about ways that victims and survivors can experience financial fraud and exploitation in tribal communities. But how can they feel empowered? What are some tips and strategies that can help tribal community members mitigate those risks and really feel like they have control? I'll start with you, Sean, and then Alicia, and then end with you, Rob.
Well, through First Nations Development Institute in partnership with Rob and the FINRA Investor Education Foundation, we do a lot of fraud awareness outreach, a lot of training, a lot of workshops in person, virtually, and also through written materials that we create. And one thing that we really stress is to be timely, right? Really look at opportunities where people could potentially be victimized and seize those opportunities as educational moments. And there was a big a federal program that just wound up last year called the Land Buyback Program. And it was a result of a big class action lawsuit a number of years ago called the Cobell Settlement. And it's been described as one of the biggest class action lawsuits in history. It had to do with misappropriation of federal dollars that were managed, Native American funds that were managed on behalf of Native American tribes and individuals by the federal government. And it resulted in some lump sum payouts, and it also resulted in some land acquisition sales in which individual Native American people in some cases got pretty sizable payments. So we made it a point to go out there with the Land Buyback Program and some of these other folks that were involved, federal partners, to go out and in addition to these trainings and outreach presentations they would do with regard to these programs, we were given an opportunity to also present information to protect individuals and communities from these issues like fraud. So it was a really good partnership in that and again, these were teachable moments because these people were actually in many cases getting lump sum payments. So we were there before those payments could go out to give them resources, to give them tools, to give them information. And I also want to talk a little bit about just the approach that we would take when we would do these workshops and presentations, and still do, in fact, because like Rob was mentioning earlier, this whole issue with, how do you use language and be careful about, saying somebody has fallen victim or something like that, put the blame on the criminal. We're also really careful to not make light of these situations. And I think in a lot of cases, there's kind of an initial response when you hear about some of these scams, especially after the fact, you kind of reflect back and kind of make a joke about them, especially romance scams, right? People talk about, the dating websites and things like that. And it's really easy to make jokes about those types of situations. It's really easy to make light of those situations. And I like to be an engaging presenter. I like to be humorous. I like to be relatable to my audiences. But at the same time, I'm very, very aware, like, look, I'm not going to make a joke, just, a tacky joke about a romance scam, because that's low hanging fruit, right? We see that all the time, because that somebody could be sitting in that audience right now and they've been a victim, or they have somebody they love or care about who's been a victim. And it's not a joke to them. It's not a joke at all. And yeah, after the fact, they might be embarrassed. They might feel humiliated. They might not want to report it because of such. And if I'm up there, making little jokes or just kind of making light of a certain type of fraud, that's not going to help the matter either. So we really want to be mindful of that angle as well going forward. But those are just a few tips I have for how to make the most impact with regard to training and outreach and education.
Thank you. Rob, do you have anything you'd like to add, or Alicia?
I mean, I think Sean covered it perfectly. I think the biggest thing we can do is to have that conversation. You all have showed up to learn more. Have those same conversations in your community. Even if it's at a small level, just start talking about what's occurring out there, the scams that are out there, the protective factors, different things that we can do to protect ourselves, our friends, our loved ones, our communities. Just having that conversation is a great way just to start.
Mm-hmm.
You want to avoid the scam wherever possible. And so there are a lot of resources online that can help you avoid that scam. Some of the suggestions from the Bureau of Indian Affairs is to block unwanted calls and text messages. When you're getting scammed or getting, a weird private number popping up on your phone, block that phone call. Don't give your personal information, financial information, to anyone in response to a request that you did not expect. Resist the pressure to act immediately. There's a scam out there right now that says your grandchild is in trouble. Send me a bunch of money right now. Just try to use your head to think logically. Well, is this there are a couple of questions you can ask. Is this a scam? Who are you? Which grandchild is it? Ask some pointed questions before you give up any sort of information or money. Know how scammers tell you how to pay. Don't give anybody any money who insists that you pay with cryptocurrency, a wire transfer, Western Union, MoneyGram, a gift card. These are usually scams. And then stop and talk to somebody that you trust. Say, if you have the time, stop and, just ask your neighbor, your community friend, call your chairman, say, hey, this happened to me. Is this valid? So those are some of the things that you can do to avoid the scam and empower yourself in the community. And tell your friends, this is what we should do.
I think that's, a perfect thing to sort of consider and really thinking about, again, locking down where appropriate our accounts. I tell people I do a lot of work around tech facilitated crimes, and one of the things I say is your first line of defense is a strong password. And so making sure you have strong passwords, making sure if you have financial, you bank online, that your banking passwords are strong, that you're not, using the same password, that you're thinking critically. Maybe you can set up 2-factor authentication on your accounts. Maybe you can, and someone brought up a good question, how does this all relate to people experiencing this with someone that they know, right? They're maybe an intimate partner, caregiver, family member, and some of these sort of strategies may not work the same because there is that familial or intimate relationship there. But there are ways in which, folks can really think about that. So we can definitely dive deeper in some of our follow-up conversations. We did have one last question that someone was asking around, how do you determine that an online message is fake? And I think their question is around jobs as well as sort of romance scams. Are there sort of keywords or strategies someone can use to sort of suss out if something isn't real?
Well, I'll start. It's getting harder and harder to suss out. So to be perfectly honest, I ignore most of them. But there are some tactics. So historically, you would have the bad grammar and you'd have things like that. Well, that's starting to improve. Some of the method that I often use most, especially if it's an email, is I go and hover over who it is that it's actually sending the email. So it might show up as irs.gov, but when you hover over it, or it might show up as amazon.com, whatever it may be, customer support, but when you hover over it, it's something that's completely not related. That's obviously a red flag. If you're getting solicitations for something that you didn't sign up for, so maybe you're getting an email that's asking you to unsubscribe and you're thinking, well, I never even signed up for this, I better unsubscribe. Well, that could be a phishing attempt, right? These are different tactics that are being used. And the best thing you can do is to slow down your process. And if it's something that you did not request, ignore it. But I like to use the hovering over the email address to see, because you can see a lot of information without actually clicking on anything. So I mentioned I've been getting those IRS, the third stimulus, IRS emails, and looking on my phone, it looks like irs.gov. But as you hover over it and as you look a little bit closer and you expand the text, you can see that there's small little differences that makes it not irs.gov. Or it could be using like an alpha instead of an A. It's something when you glance at it quickly, it looks like an A, but it's not the A that you would see typically used on a computer.
Yeah. I want to add, like Rob said, it's just getting harder and harder. I got a text message a few months ago, and it appeared to be from my bank saying that there was a problem with my account and they wanted me to log in. And I actually did. I actually began to log in because it was from my bank and I had made some purchases and they had just got me right. And that's another thing we always want to say, don't ever be overconfident, because anybody can be victimized. Any of us could be victimized. Anybody can. Those fraudsters, they know when to strike, when you're vulnerable, that perfect moment, and they can get you. And they got me, and I did go ahead and click on the link. And then I realized this is not good. So right away I got out, I called my bank. We ended up, going through all these safety checks and everything, but they got me there. Luckily, I mean, I didn't send money, but it was really close. And another lesson I have, what I'll do is I'll just like the other day, I mean, it's interesting, we're doing this webinar on Zoom, but there was that Zoom class action lawsuit. How many people here in the webinar got that notice, right? I did. I got this email, oh, Zoom class action lawsuit, click here. Well, I was like, well, wait a second here. I haven't heard of this, So what do? I just Googled Zoom class action lawsuit. Is it legit? And there's several websites out there that, yeah, it's legit, and they're going through all the information. So they know, it's okay. You're okay to click, and you can read up on it and get updated. So I'll just do something like that. If something comes along, some weird email, rather than, or something that tempts me, I'll just run a quick Google search and see what other people are saying and doing, and before responding or before taking it, because you never know. Like the Zoom class action lawsuit, I could have just deleted and said this is a scam, but that was legit, and I just got my $50 check from Zoom in the mail the other day. So I mean, sometimes you don't just want to necessarily delete everything, because you never know. It could be legit, and it could be a $50 payday from Zoom.
Yeah. Verifying to a third-party source is such an important step to take. So
Yes.
Even if I get something from Amazon or PayPal or whatever it may be, I don't, even if it looks completely legitimate, I don't click on anything in that email. I go directly to my account. I log into my account. You can find all that same information there. If it's a credit card, same thing. And it's hard to be able to determine which ones are actual emails, like Sean said, and which ones are fraudulent. But always checking into that third-party source is a great protective strategy.
Absolutely. It's pervasive. Fraudsters, scammers are everywhere. We need to keep our defenses up and know that we have to verify our sources before we're handing over our hard-earned money.
Yep. And I feel like that's the next webinar, is the connections between AI and ChatGPT and financial fraud, right? So we have less than a minute left. And so want to thank Rob, Alicia, Sean for joining us today for this robust conversation. I know I had a good time. I hope you all had a good time. You learned something that you can take back to your work, and that we're going to continue these conversations. As a reminder, this is a recorded webinar. We will make sure in the coming weeks you get this recording, an evaluation, and the materials. We have a lot of links that you all put in the chat, as well as my colleagues have some contacts and some resources that they want to share. So we will make sure you get that in the follow-up email. If you need anything from NCVC, please reach out to me at rgibson@victimsofcrime.org. And just to let you all know, if you want to hear more about this great topic, you can come to our National Training Institute in September, held in Boston, where we're going to continue conversations like this and more. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful Thursday, and we'll see you on the next webinar. Thanks, everyone.